The moment Kate Garner stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1878, the wind hit her so hard it nearly stole the hat right off her dark-pinned hair, and every man standing on that dusty Main Street turned to look at her like she was something they had never quite seen before and were not entirely sure what to do about. She straightened her hat with one gloved hand, lifted her traveling trunk herself before the driver could offer to help, and walked forward with the kind of posture that a woman only develops after years of making herself unmistakable in rooms that did not want her there. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher by training and by calling, the daughter of a Minnesota homesteader who had died 3 winters ago and left her nothing but a quarter section of frozen land and the absolute certainty that she was capable of surviving whatever the world decided to throw at her. She had answered the advertisement in the Cheyenne newspaper. Harlan Creek needed a schoolteacher. The previous one, a young man named Ferris, had lasted exactly 1 winter and then taken the first coach east with both hands shaking and his luggage half-packed. Kate had read that part of the posting and smiled to herself before she even finished the paragraph. She was not the type of woman who ran from things. The town of Harlan Creek sat in a long valley between 2 ridgelines that looked like they had been pushed up out of the earth by something old and irritable. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other if neither driver was being difficult about it. There was a general store, a livery, a barber shop, a sheriff's office, a small church with a slightly crooked steeple, a saloon called the Red Clay, and a handful of residences that fanned out from the main drag like spokes on a loose wheel. The schoolhouse was at the edge of town, a low-roofed building with windows that rattled when the wind picked up, which, as Kate would learn, was most of the time. The man who had written to confirm her position was named Mayor Elwood, a round-faced, earnest man who met her at the stagecoach stop with a handshake that was more enthusiastic than firm and a smile that suggested he was relieved she was real. "Miss Garner," he said, pumping her hand, "welcome to Harlan Creek. I do want to say before anything else that we are terribly grateful you responded to our posting. We have been without a teacher since March." "I gathered," Kate said pleasantly. "How many students?" 11 at present, ages 6 through 14. Could be more if the homesteaders to the north settle their families in before winter. "And when does winter arrive here?" Mayor Elwood's smile flickered just slightly, in the way that a candle does when someone opens a door nearby. "We typically see the first real snow by mid-November. The valley can be quite challenging in the colder months. The wind comes down off the ridgeline with some force, and the temperature can drop quite. I grew up in Minnesota," Kate said. "I am not worried about the cold." The mayor blinked at her for a moment, then laughed with what sounded like genuine relief, and led her toward the boarding house where she would stay until the teaching post officially began. It was on her second full day in Harlan Creek, while she was walking the length of the main street to get a sense of the town and its geography, that she first encountered Abel Barlow. She almost ran directly into him, if she was honest about it, because she was reading a folded piece of paper while she walked, and he was coming around the corner of the general store from the opposite direction at a stride that suggested he had somewhere to be, and was already slightly behind schedule getting there. They stopped within about 8 inches of each other, both pulling up short, and Kate looked up from her paper and found herself looking at a man who was taller than she expected from that distance and considerably more weathered. He was 28 years old, though she did not know that yet. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of deep creek water in summer, somewhere between gray and green depending on the angle of the light, and his jaw carried about 3 days of dark stubble. He was wearing a worn canvas coat, working clothes, and boots that had seen a great deal of hard country. There was a coiled rope over one shoulder and a set of leather gloves tucked into his belt. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had been working this land since before he was old enough to have a vote in the matter. He was the foreman of the Dent cattle operation, the largest ranch in the valley, which ran several hundred head across the eastern grassland and up into the foothills. He had held that position for 4 years, having come to Wyoming from Nebraska with a set of skills that ranch owners respected, and a disposition that most people in Harlan Creek had learned meant something when he gave his word on something. He was not, by nature, a man who talked much. But he was not unfriendly. He was simply the kind of man who said things when he had something to say and saved the quiet for when he did not. "Ma'am," he said, stepping to the side to let her pass. "My apologies." "No harm done," Kate said, folding her paper back up. "I was the one not watching where I was going." He studied her for just a fraction of a second longer than courtesy strictly required, in the way that a person does when something unexpected has crossed their path, and their brain is still catching up with their eyes. Then he nodded once and moved on around the corner, and Kate turned to watch him go for just a moment before she caught herself doing it and redirected her attention to the store front ahead. She asked about him that evening at supper at the boarding house, where she ate with the proprietress, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Holt, and 2 traveling salesmen who were waiting out a wheel repair on their wagon. "Abel Barlow," Mrs. Holt said, without any particular inflection. "Foreman out at the Dent Ranch. Been here going on 5 years, quiet sort, does his work well. Dent thinks the world of him. She passed the butter. Not married." Kate did not ask why she had included that last detail. She simply filed it away without comment and reached for the biscuits. The school opened on a Monday in early October with 9 students, 2 of the anticipated 11 having been kept home by parents who wanted help with the last of the harvest before the weather changed. Kate had spent the weekend before organizing the schoolroom, rewriting the schedule that Ferris had apparently abandoned mid-lesson in the spring and never bothered to complete, and assessing the condition of the reading books, which was not great. She wrote a supply list, submitted it to Mayor Elwood, and began. The children were, as children tended to be, a mixture of interested and suspicious and simply present because they had been told to be. The youngest was a girl named Pearl, who was 6 and extremely solemn, and had apparently already decided she liked Miss Garner because she brought her a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the first morning. The oldest was a boy named James Whitfield, who was 14 and large for his age, and had clearly decided that he did not need to be at school, a position Kate systematically dismantled over the course of that first week by the simple method of finding out what he actually cared about, which turned out to be horses, and demonstrating that mathematics applied directly to horse breeding, bloodlines, and the economics of selling stock. At which point, his entire attitude rearranged itself into something approaching engagement. Kate liked her work. She had always liked it. There was something deeply satisfying to her about watching a child connect to an idea, about that precise moment when something clicked behind someone's eyes and you could actually see it happen. It was the best part of what she did, and she pursued it with the same focused energy she brought to everything else. She had been in Harlan Creek for 3 weeks when Abel Barlow came to the schoolhouse. It was after the children had gone home for the day, and she was erasing the arithmetic from the large chalkboard, still in her teaching dress with her dark hair coming a little loose from its pins the way it always did by late afternoon. She heard the door and turned to find him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which told her immediately that whatever he had come to say was something he had thought about before he said it. "Mr. Barlow," she said, recognizing him immediately. "Come in." He stepped inside, looking around the schoolroom with the kind of attention a practical man gives to spaces, assessing the structure, the windows, the stove in the corner. "Miss Garner, I hope I am not interrupting anything." "Only my ongoing argument with chalk dust," she said. "What can I do for you?" "I have a neighbor," he said. "Family named Reyes, Spanish-speaking, settled about 4 miles east last spring. They have a boy, 8 years old, name of Lewis. His father is trying to learn the English well enough to trade and conduct business, but he is not there yet, and they have been hesitant to send the boy to school because they were not sure of the welcome. Kate set down her eraser. Are you telling me there is a child not attending school because of concerns about being made unwelcome? I am. Then please tell the Ray's family that Louis is expected Monday morning, she said, with a directness that was not unkind but left no room for uncertainty. I will speak with the other families myself if I need to. I have not run a classroom where a child felt unwelcome, and I am not about to start. Something shifted in Abel Barlow's expression, something quiet and not easily named, like the way the light changes on open land just before the sun comes fully over the ridge. He nodded slowly. I will tell them, thank you, Miss Garner. Is that all? It is, he said. Then he paused with his hand on the doorframe. I heard you came from Minnesota. I did. You should know the winters here can be quite severe. The valley traps the cold wind, and we sometimes go weeks without a real thaw. The man who had this post before you left in February. She looked at him steadily, without flinching, the way she had always looked at anything that was supposed to seem difficult or forbidding. And then she said, with a calm that was not bravado but something deeper and more settled than that, something that had been built over years of cold mornings and frozen water pails and making heat from nothing. Good. I was not raised to fear the cold. He looked at her for one long, quiet moment, and something in his face changed again, more significantly this time, like a lock turning over in a door that had been closed for a good while. No, he said, as if he was agreeing with something larger than what she had said. I don't suppose you were. Then he put his hat back on and walked out, and the wind took the door gently behind him, and Kate stood in the schoolroom with the chalk dust still on her hands and felt, for the first time since arriving in Harlan Creek, like something had just started. Louis Ray's arrived on Monday as promised, a small boy with enormous dark eyes and a serious expression, accompanied by his father Esteban, who shook Kate's hand with great formality and thanked her in careful, halting English for the opportunity. Kate responded first in English and then, because she had grown up with a Spanish-speaking family on the neighboring farm in Minnesota, and had absorbed enough of the language to be conversational, in Spanish, which produced in Esteban Ray's a look of such profound relief and gratitude that Kate had to take a very deliberate breath to keep her composure about it. Louis proved to be quick and diligent and deeply proud, and within 2 weeks he and Pearl had formed an alliance based entirely on their shared love of drawing pictures in the margins of their slates, which Kate pretended not to notice because the drawings were very good. Abel Barlow came back to the schoolhouse on a Thursday in late October, this time with 2 older reading books he had apparently found somewhere, the kind of heavy, serious volumes that someone had clearly cared for. He set them on her desk with a matter-of-fact air, as if bringing gifts required no explanation or acknowledgement. Found these in storage out at the ranch, he said. Thought they might be of use. She looked at the titles. Geography of the Western Territories and a volume of collected essays on natural history. These are excellent, thank you. Dent's wife brought them out years ago, he said. She passed in '74. He has not gone through her things particularly. I am sorry to hear that. He is a good man. The grief hit him hard. He paused. I wanted to ask how Louis is settling in. Very well, Kate said, and meant it. He has already surpassed 2 of the older students in arithmetic. He has an excellent mind. Abel seemed genuinely pleased by this, in the contained way that was natural to him, a small brightness in those gray-green eyes and a slight softening at the corners of his mouth. Good. His father works harder than anyone I know. That family deserves to do well here. Do you speak Spanish yourself? Some. Enough to work with the vaqueros we hired during Roundup. He turned his hat in his hands, which she had already come to recognize as a habit of his when he was thinking about how to say something. I am sorry if I seemed forward coming to your school the other way. It was not my business to interfere. You advocated for a child's education, Kate said. That is not interference. That is decency. He looked at her again in that way he had, with the kind of steady, unhurried attention that most people in her life had never given her, because most people expected women to be looked past rather than looked at, and she felt the warmth of it somewhere in her chest before she could decide how she felt about that. "Would you like to see the schoolroom?" she said, surprising herself slightly by the invitation. He accepted it without making it into anything larger than it was, and she walked him through the small room, showing him the supply situation, the books, the schedule she had devised, the way she had arranged the desks so that the younger students sat nearer the stove and the older ones farther away since they complained less of the cold. He listened to all of it with genuine attention, asking practical questions about the stove's performance and whether the window seals would hold against winter drafts. By the time he left 20 minutes later, Kate was smiling at the closed door in a way that she did not examine too closely, because examining things too closely too early had never done her any particular good, and she was a practical woman. November arrived in Harlan Creek, the way winter always arrived in high country, not with warning but with sudden authority. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 days, and the first real snow came on a Thursday evening, light at first and then thickening through the night, until by Friday morning, the world outside Kate's boarding house window was a white landscape, with the ridgelines vanished behind low gray cloud and the wind moving across the open valley, with a sound that was almost musical if you were inside listening to it, and not particularly comforting if you were outside in it. Kate put on her heaviest coat and her wool scarf and her good boots and walked to the schoolhouse before any of her students arrived, got the stove lit, and was marking reading assignments when Pearl came in first with her nose red and her eyes bright with the excitement of snow. The temperature held below freezing for a week straight, and on the second Friday of that cold snap, when Kate was walking back from the general store with a wrapped parcel of writing chalk and some dried goods she had ordered, the wagon that appeared around the eastern bend of the main street was moving a little too fast on the ice-backed road, and she had to step back sharply toward the wooden walkway to avoid being caught by it. She stepped back, caught her heel on a raised board, and sat down very suddenly and with considerable force in the snow against the wall of the feed store. For a moment she sat there taking stock of herself, which was a habit she had developed early, always assess before you react, and determined that nothing was injured except her dignity, which she considered an acceptable casualty. The parcel was intact. Her hat was still on. She was simply sitting in the snow in front of the feed store in the middle of the afternoon, and several people were now looking at her. Abel Barlow was one of them, having apparently just come out of the feed store itself. He was at her side before she had fully gathered herself, crouching down to her eye level with a focused, careful expression. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said clearly. "I am merely sitting on the ground." "I saw the wagon clip you. It did not clip me," she said. "I stepped back and I fell over a board. My dignity is the only casualty." She looked at his outstretched hand for one beat, then took it, and he helped her to her feet with an economy of effort that was efficient without making her feel pulled at. She was standing very close to him for a moment, both of them catching their breath, and the cold air was sharp and clean between them. "Thank you," she said. "You're certain you are not hurt?" "I am entirely certain." She brushed snow from the back of her coat. "You can stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're calculating which part of me might be broken." Something that might have been a laugh moved through his expression, suppressed but real. "Occupational habit," he said. "You check the stock when they've taken a fall." "I am not stock, Mr. Barlow." "No," he said, and there was something warm and completely unguarded in his voice for exactly 1 second before it settled back into its usual measured register. "You are definitely not." She adjusted her hat and her parcel and thanked him again and walked on, and she could feel the warmth of that one unguarded second following her all the way back to the boarding house, not settling but not leaving either. In early December, there was an evening gathering at the church that functioned as a sort of community supper and winter social. the kind of event that small towns in the territory held to keep themselves connected through the long, cold months when the distance between homesteads could feel immense. Kate went because Mayor Elwood had asked her specifically, wanting the community to have a chance to meet their new teacher properly, and she was not in the habit of refusing things she had agreed to do. The church hall was warm and loud with people and lantern light, and the good smell of food that families had brought from their various homes. Kate wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-green wool, and put her hair up with more care than usual, and told herself that she was doing so because it was a formal community gathering and not for any other reason. She had been there for perhaps an hour, moving through conversations with the ease of a woman who was genuinely interested in people and their lives, learning which families had come from where, which children belonged to which parents, which of the older men had been in the valley longest. When she found herself standing near the windows with a cup of warm cider and realized that Abel Barlow had arrived sometime in the last 20 minutes and was standing across the room talking to Esteban Reyes with the kind of relaxed attentiveness that told her this was a friendship, not just an acquaintance. He caught her looking, and the corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. She looked away first, which was unusual for her. He found his way to her side about 15 minutes later, carrying his own cup and looking like a man who was comfortable in this room without being particularly dependent on it. "Good evening, Miss Garner, Mr. Barlow. I did not know you attended these gatherings." "Most years I miss them," he admitted. "Too much to manage at the ranch in December, but Dent gave the crew some time off this week. Weather's holding and the herd is settled." "How is the ranch managing the winter?" "Well enough. It is always the February storms you have to watch for. That is when it gets genuinely difficult." He looked at her sideways. "Still not afraid of the cold?" "Still not," she said, and sipped her cider. "Although I will admit the wind down the main street between the general store and the boarding house is more determined than I anticipated." "The valley shape funnels it," he said. "In February, you will want to string a rope from the boarding house door to wherever you are going if you leave in a whiteout. The visibility drops to nothing." "I grew up stringing ropes between the barn and the house," she said. "My father taught me that before I could reach the door latch." He looked at her with an expression of what she could only describe as careful, attentive respect. "What was it like, Minnesota farming?" And because he asked as if he genuinely wanted to know, and not as if he was looking for a polite way to fill the silence, she told him. She told him about her father's quarter section on the edge of a frozen lake, about the winters that came in October and did not leave until April, about the spring mud that swallowed boot and wheel alike, about learning to drive a team of horses at 10, and to harness them alone at 12 because her father's hands had begun to trouble him, and she was the only one there to help. She told him about her mother, who had died when Kate was 17, a fever in March that came and went in 10 days and left the two of them looking at each other across a kitchen that felt too large. She told him about the silence after that, and the way her father had begun to drink quietly and steadily, not violently but relentlessly, and how she had finished her schooling by reading every book in the county lending library because the school had stopped having a teacher that year. She told him about going to Fargo at 20 and putting herself through the teaching certification program by working evenings cleaning offices, and about coming back to find her father had died in his sleep the previous winter and left her the land and nothing else. She did not know why she was telling him all of this. She was not a woman who explained herself to people casually, but his listening was different from other people's listening. He did not look for a pause so he could insert his own experience or offer a solution. He simply listened with those quiet creekwater eyes, and she could tell that he was keeping every word. "I am sorry about your father," he said when she finished. "And your mother. They were both good people who had difficult lives," she said. "I do not think either of them would want to be mourned more than remembered. That is a generous way to look at it. It is the only way that helps." He was quiet for a moment, Someone across the room was beginning to play a fiddle, something lively and not particularly precise, and people were starting to move furniture back for dancing. "I grew up in Nebraska," he said. "My father ran cattle and my mother taught herself to read from a single Bible and 3 almanacs. She read everything she could get her hands on. She always wanted the children to be educated." "Did you go to school?" "Through age 12, he said. "Then my father needed me at the ranch, but my mother kept teaching us evenings until we left home. She died the winter before I came out here. My father sold the land 2 years later. My brothers went different directions." "Do you see them?" "Not often. Letters sometimes." He paused. "I have made my home here. Harlan Creek is not where I started, but it is where I intend to stay." Something in the way he said that last sentence was heavier than it looked, like a stone that is larger below the water than above it, and Kate looked at him and thought that Abel Barlow was a man who had chosen his life quite deliberately and was not in the habit of second-guessing that choice. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why did you come to advocate for Louis Reyes? You could have let it be. It was not strictly your responsibility." He seemed to consider the question genuinely, the way he did with things that deserved consideration. "Because he is 8 years old," he said. "And because his family came here in good faith and are working good and hard. And because a child should not be shut out of learning because the world has not yet figured out how to deserve him." He looked at her. "And because I know what it is like to grow up without enough of it." Kate looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, careful man standing beside her in a lantern-lit church hall, while someone played a fiddle badly and the cold pressed in against the windows. She felt something that she recognized with a certain wariness, because it was large and unhurried and entirely unlike anything she had decided to feel. She felt it anyway. "Would you like to dance, Mr. Barlow?" She asked because she was not a woman who waited for things she wanted. He looked startled, which was endearing because he was not a man who startled easily, and then something shifted in his face into something open and warm and a little careful, the way you look at something you want but are not entirely sure you have the right to want. "I'm not a very accomplished dancer," he said. "Neither is the person playing the fiddle," she said. "I think we will match well enough." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him actually laugh, and it was a real, full sound, brief but genuine, and it changed his whole face into something younger and easier, and Kate thought, with the quiet conviction of someone who has made up their mind about something important, "Oh, this is going to be a considerable problem." They danced twice that evening, badly and cheerfully, and talked between sets about the geography of the territory, about the Reyes family's land situation, about the political mess in the Wyoming Territory regarding land rights and water claims, and about which constellations were visible from the valley in winter. They were still talking when most of the other guests had begun to gather coats and children, and Mayor Elwood was extinguishing the outer lanterns with the look of a man who is too polite to say directly that it is time to go home. Abel walked her back to the boarding house through the cold, dark street. The stars were extraordinary above the valley, hard and brilliant in the winter air, and their breath made small clouds that drifted away behind them. At the boarding house door they stopped, and he was close enough that she could smell the cold on his coat and the wood smoke from the church hall stove. "Good night, Miss Garner," he said. "Good night, Mr. Barlow." She went inside, and it was only after the door was closed that she allowed herself the smile. December deepened. The cold settled into the valley like something that had decided to stay, which it had. Kate kept the schoolhouse fire burning every day and brought the younger children close to it for their morning lessons, and the older students helped carry wood from the pile behind the building without being asked, which told her they were becoming invested in the room as a place they felt they belonged. Abel Barlow found reasons to pass by the schoolhouse with some regularity throughout that month, which she noticed and which she took careful stock of. He brought the stovewood one afternoon when the older students had used the last of the pile, and she had not yet had a chance to contact anyone about replenishing it. He brought a set of new chalk, which were better quality than the ones she had sourced from the general store. He stopped one evening when she had stayed late to grade written work and saw the light in the window and knocked on the door and stayed for an hour helping her hang a new map of the United States territories that she had ordered, and that required two people to manage safely given the low ceiling and the awkward angles involved. They talked through all of it. He asked her about what she taught, and she explained it in detail because he was interested and asked real questions. She asked him about the cattle operation, and he explained the economics and logistics of running a herd through a Wyoming winter with a specificity that told her he was genuinely skilled at what he did and had thought hard about it. They argued pleasantly about whether the territorial government was doing enough to support small homesteaders against the large cattle operations that were consolidating land in certain parts of the territory, which was a real and pressing injustice in Wyoming at that time. And Kate had strong opinions that she expressed without apology, and Abel did not tell her she was being too forceful or that it was not her business, because he largely agreed with her and said so. And said further that he made it a point to advocate for the smaller families with Dent, who was a large operator but a fair one. She was falling in love with him. She knew it by December the 15th, which was a Sunday, because she woke up that morning and her first thought was about something he had said 3 days earlier about the migratory patterns of pronghorn antelope in the valley, and the thought made her smile before she was even fully awake, and she lay in her narrow boarding-house bed and looked at the frost on the window glass and thought, "Well, Kate Garner, here you are." She was not frightened by it. Fear had never done her much good. But she was careful with it, the way you are careful with something precious that you are still not sure belongs to you. Christmas that year in Harlan Creek was a community affair, as it tended to be in small frontier towns where the winter made isolation a real physical fact, and people leaned toward each other by necessity and by choice. Kate organized a small pageant at the school, which the children performed with great seriousness, and which required James Whitfield to stand very still for 20 minutes while wearing a paper crown, a challenge he met with the kind of stoic endurance that she suspected would serve him well in life. Abel came to the pageant. He sat in the back row with his hat on his knee and watched with those quiet eyes and clapped at the end with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. And afterward, when the families had all gathered around to collect their children and admire the decorations Kate had put up, he was still there. And when everyone else had gone, he was still there. And she was tidying the room, and he was watching her in the way that had become familiar to her over these weeks, the way that felt like being seen rather than watched. "It was very good," he said. "The children did well. They worked hard," she said. "James surprised me. I thought he would resist the whole enterprise." "James Whitfield would walk through fire if you asked him to," Abel said. "He talks about you to his father. Apparently mathematics has become something of an obsession." Kate laughed. "Good. He has a sharp mind. He should use it." Abel stood and moved to help her fold the last of the paper decorations, working with the same careful competence he brought to everything, and they worked in companionable silence for a moment, which was one of the things she had come to love about being with him, that the quiet between them felt good instead of empty. "I have something for you," he said, and produced from his coat pocket a small, cloth-wrapped parcel that he set on the desk beside her. She looked at him and then at it and then unwrapped it. Inside was a small compass, brass, with a beautifully etched case, old but well-maintained and still perfectly functional. She turned it in her hands and the needle swung true. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She brought it from her home in the East when she married my father. She always said it was how she knew where she was when everything else felt uncertain." Kate looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because he had just given her something that could not be given casually or taken casually, and they both understood that. "Abel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "I know it is not a conventional gift," he said, with a slight roughness in his voice as if he was managing something, but you seemed like a person who would know what to do with it." "I do," she said. "Thank you, I will take very good care of it." He nodded, and then he said carefully, "Kate," and the way he said it was different from the way anything else had ever been said to her, measured and particular and full of weight. "I should tell you something." "Tell me." "I have been thinking about you quite considerably since about the second week of October," he said, with the direct simplicity of a man who does not know any other way to say a true thing. "I think about our conversations while I am working, and I find myself looking for reasons to come by the school that I am not proud of, and I am not a man who plays at things, so I am telling you this plainly because I think you deserve plain things." Kate set the compass down very carefully on the desk and turned fully to face him. Her heart was doing something undignified, and she was choosing to ignore it. "I have been thinking about you considerably as well," she said, just as directly. "Since approximately the same time." He exhaled, like something had been held and then let go. "I am not a woman who needs things to be slow," she said, "but I am also not a woman who is impractical. I have a position here. My work matters to me, and I intend to keep doing it." "I would never ask you to stop," he said, and the immediacy of it told her he meant it entirely. "Then I think we understand each other," she said. He reached out and took her hand, not in the tentative way of men who are uncertain, but in the steady, warm way of a man who has made up his mind and is at peace with it. And she let him hold it. And they stood there in the schoolroom with the frost on the windows and the last of the candle burning low between them. And Kate thought that this was what it felt like when something began, not with a crash but with a great, deep settling, like the earth finding its level. January arrived, and the valley winter did not disappoint. The temperature dropped to places that made even the weathered ranchers speak of it with a kind of sober respect, and the wind came off the ridgeline with the consistency and personality of something that had a grievance it intended to address. The snow that fell in the third week of January was the kind that packed and stayed, and the main street of Harlan Creek was navigated by a network of paths shoveled through the drifts rather than by the wide open road that existed in summer. Kate shoveled the path to the schoolhouse herself every morning before the children arrived, which she did without complaint because it needed doing and it was her school, and the exercise kept her warm. Two of the older students started arriving early to help with the shoveling in the second week, which she acknowledged with a matter-of-fact gratitude that she suspected they found more meaningful than a more effusive response would have been. Abel came to town when the ranch work and the roads allowed, which was not as often as either of them would have liked. And when he came, they walked together in the cold and sat by the fire in the boarding house sitting room when Mrs. Holt was occupied elsewhere, and on one occasion Mrs. Holt invited them both for supper in a pointed and completely transparent gesture of social engineering that made Abel raise an eyebrow and Kate bite her lip to keep from laughing. They were not secret about what they were to each other, not because they were careless about appearances, but because Kate had never been comfortable with pretense, and Abel was constitutionally incapable of acting like something was not what it was. Harlan Creek was a small town and people noticed things, and there was talk, as there always was, some of it kind and some of it merely curious, and some of it the inevitable variety that attached itself to a single woman who did not behave with the deference expected of her. There was one afternoon in late January when Kate went into the general store for supplies and found herself adjacent to a conversation between two women she did not know well, ranchers' wives who were in town for supplies, and she heard her name mentioned in a tone that was not particularly pleasant, and heard also the word "forward" applied to her in a way that was clearly not complimentary. She purchased her supplies and thanked the store owner, and walked back out into the cold without responding to what she had heard, because she had learned a long time ago that defending yourself to people who have already decided what they think of you is an activity with a very poor return on investment. She told Abel about it that evening, and he listened with an expression that moved through careful neutrality, and then something darker, and then settled into a kind of considered quiet. Do you want me to say something to anyone? No, she said immediately. Absolutely not. This is my business to manage. I know it is, he said. I was asking if you wanted the help. She looked at him. No, she said more gently this time, but I appreciate that you asked instead of doing it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. For what it is worth, he said, most people in this town respect you. I have heard more said about what a good teacher you are and how much the children have come to look forward to school than I have ever heard about any teacher we have had here. That other talk comes from people who are limited by their own expectations. I know, she said. It does not hurt me. It used to when I was younger. Now it just bores me. He laughed, that brief genuine laugh she had come to love, and reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. And she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while listening to the wind work over the roof of the boarding house. And it was enough. February came in with exactly the drama that Abel had warned her about. The first big storm arrived on a Tuesday evening, without much warning beyond a lowering of the sky and a change in the quality of the wind, that the people who had lived in the valley long enough could read like a page. By morning, the visibility in the main street was poor enough that you could not see the general store from the front steps of the boarding house, and the snow was driving horizontally, and the cold was the kind that got through every seam of a coat within minutes. Kate went to the schoolhouse anyway. She wore everything she owned that was warm, tied a scarf over her hat, and navigated by memory and proximity to the buildings on the far side of the street. She got the stove lit and waited, and not one single student came that morning, which was the correct decision, and she wrote a note on the board for whoever might eventually come to check on the building, and then sat with the stove and a book for 2 hours, making sure the pipes did not freeze before the temperature inside the building stabilized well enough that she could leave safely. She was halfway back to the boarding house when she heard her name called through the wind and the snow, and turned to find Abel there, appearing through the white like something conjured, wrapped in his heaviest coat with his scarf pulled up and his hat pulled down, and his eyes the only recognizable part of him. He had ridden in from the ranch because the storm had looked worse in the direction of town, and he had been concerned about the schoolhouse pipe situation, which was, Kate noted privately, the same thing she had just spent 2 hours addressing. I was worried, he said simply, when they were close enough to hear each other properly. I can take care of myself, she said, but I am glad you came. He walked her back to the boarding house through the storm, one hand at her back in the gusting sections, and Mrs. Holt opened the door before they knocked as if she had been watching, and told Abel Barlow that if he was going to be sensible, he was going to stay until the storm cleared and she had a room, and there would be supper at 5. Abel accepted, because he was a sensible man and the ride back in those conditions would have been genuinely dangerous. He spent the afternoon in the sitting room, and Kate sat across from him, and they talked for hours, some of it about practical things and some of it about everything else, about who they were and what they wanted and what they believed about the world, and how they had each arrived at those beliefs through the particular education of living their actual lives. She told him about the moment she had decided to become a teacher, which was when she was 9 years old and her mother had taught her to read properly, sitting at the kitchen table with a lantern between them and the snow at the window. And Kate had felt something open up inside her brain that she had not known was there, this tremendous, lit-up space. And she had wanted every other person to have access to that space, because it was the best thing she had ever been given. He told her about the moment he had decided to stay in Wyoming, which was in his first spring here, when he had ridden up to the top of the eastern ridge at dawn and looked out over the valley in the early light, with the dew on the grass and the mountains beyond and the sky that color that exists only in that kind of early morning in that kind of high country, and something in him had said, "Here, this is where you are. Do you ever miss Nebraska?" she asked. "I miss who I was there," he said. "But not enough to go back." She looked at him across the room, this man who had made himself out of hard work and quiet thought, and a particular kind of loyalty to the people and places he chose. And she thought with the same clear certainty she brought to everything important. I want to know this man for the rest of my life. The storm lasted 2 days and cleared on Thursday morning into a sky of such brittle, brilliant blue that it seemed impossible the same sky had been white and angry 48 hours before. The snow lay deep and clean across the valley, and the ridgelines were sharp against the blue, and the world looked like someone had remade it very carefully while everyone slept. Abel stayed for breakfast and then prepared to ride back to the ranch, and they stood outside the boarding house in the cold, clear air while his horse shifted in the snow, and he looked at her with those steady eyes and said something he had clearly been building toward for a while. I know this is not the conventional way to do this, he said, and I know you have told me you value your work, and I want you to know that I understand that, and I am not asking you to set it aside. But I am asking you to consider a future, with me, not right this minute, but as a direction. Kate looked at him for a long moment. The sun was brilliant on the snow and the cold was clean and sharp and everything was very clear. I have been considering it since approximately Christmas Eve, she said. He exhaled. And, yes, she said, that is my answer. Yes, that is the direction I want to go. He crossed the space between them and kissed her, and it was brief and cold-tipped and warm at the center and utterly certain, and she put her hand against his cold, rough jaw and kissed him back, and Mrs. Holt, watching from the front window, made a small sound of satisfied approval and went to put the kettle on. Spring came slowly and with effort to Harlan Creek, which was in Kate's experience how the best things tended to arrive. March was still cold and difficult, with 2 more storms that tested the valley's patience, and April was mud and melt, and the particular exhaustion of waiting for something that is on its way but not yet there. But by May the grass was coming back, and the snow had retreated to the high ridges, and the creek that ran through the southern edge of the valley was running fast and cold with snowmelt, and the whole world smelled like green things and turned earth. The school year was winding toward its end, which meant Kate was already thinking about the following year, what new materials she needed, which students would come up from the lower grades, whether Louis Reyes's younger sister, now 5 3/4 by Louis's proud report, might start in September. She had written to the Territorial Board of Education about the state of the schoolroom, specifically the windows that rattled and the one section of floor near the door that had begun to give when you stepped on it, and had received a response that was supportive but non-committal on timing, which she expected. Abel came to town more regularly in spring when the ranch work settled into its post-winter rhythms. He helped, on one extended Saturday, with repairing the floor section and the windows, bringing 2 of the ranch hands with him to do the work properly. Esteban Reyes came as well, and between the 4 of them the schoolroom was in considerably better shape by sundown than it had been at dawn. Esteban thanked Kate formally when the work was done, in his careful English that had improved significantly over the winter. He told her that Louis talked about school every evening and had started teaching his mother the alphabet in the evenings. Kate's composure held, but it was close. Abel proposed to her formally in May, on a Sunday afternoon when he had taken her on horseback up to the eastern ridge to show her the view he had described to her in February. It was everything he had said and more. The valley spread out below them in the May afternoon light, the mountains blue and white in the distance, the creek a silver thread through the green of the lower ground, and Harlan Creek itself small and exact and real as a place where people had decided to make their lives. He did not make it complicated. He took a ring from his coat pocket, a simple gold band with a small setting that had also belonged to his mother, and he held it out and he said, "I want to marry you, Kate Garner. I want to build something here with you. I want to come home to you. I want you to be my wife, and I want to be the kind of man who deserves that." She took the ring from his hand and looked at it and then looked at him. At this man she had been learning for 8 months. This man she had found on the street outside the general store and argued with about education policy, and danced badly with in a church hall, and sat with through a February blizzard, and talked herself hoarse with about the nature of things. This man who had given her his mother's compass and brought books for her school and advocated for a child, he had no obligation to advocate for simply because it was the right thing to do. "You already are that man," she said. "Yes." He put the ring on her finger and pulled her in and held her, standing on the ridge above the valley in the May sunshine with the wind gentle and the world below them wide and real, and she put her arms around him and thought, "Here. This is where you are." They were married in July, in the little church with the slightly crooked steeple, on a Saturday afternoon when the whole town of Harlan Creek seemed to have decided to attend. Mrs. Holt cried, which she denied afterward. Mayor Elwood gave a speech that was twice as long as anyone had anticipated. Esteban Reyes brought his whole family, and his wife Maria, who was a warm, capable woman who had taken to Kate from their first meeting, brought a cake that was better than anything else at the reception. Louis and Pearl stood together near the church steps and were very solemn about the whole thing in the way that children are when they sense something important is happening, and they are not sure of their exact role in it. James Whitfield, who at 15 now stood nearly as tall as Abel, shook Abel's hand with great seriousness and told him that Miss Garner, or rather Mrs. Barlow, was the best teacher he had ever had, and he had only had 2, so the competition was limited, but he meant it absolutely. Abel told him that he entirely agreed and that James should apply that mathematical mind of his to something great. Abel's younger brother Thomas, the only one of his brothers who could make the journey, came from Nebraska and stood at his brother's side through the ceremony with a quiet pride that made Abel look at him, once with the particular warmth of a man who has missed someone more than he has admitted. Kate liked Thomas immediately. He had some of Abel's directness without quite as much of the restraint, and he told her over the reception dinner that he was glad his brother had found someone who could, as he put it, keep up with him, and she laughed and said she thought they kept up with each other. They moved into Abel's house, which was a solidly built 2-story structure about half a mile east of the main ranch buildings on the Dent property, on a piece of land that Abel had purchased rights to that Dent had offered him as part of his long-term arrangement with the ranch. It was not large, but it was well made, and it had a good stove and solid windows and a wide front porch that faced west, which meant that the evening light came straight in summer, and the sunsets were of the dramatic variety that this part of Wyoming produced without apparent effort. Kate kept her school. This was not a matter of negotiation because it had never needed to be, but she appreciated that it was understood absolutely between them, the same way she understood that the ranch work came with demands on Abel's time that were seasonal and non-negotiable, and that she would need to manage her own days accordingly. What they had was not a small or easy life, but it was genuinely theirs, built by 2 people who had each been doing things on their own for long enough to know that choosing to share it was an act of will and not of necessity, which made it mean considerably more. The second winter of her time in Harlan Creek was the first winter of their marriage, and Kate went into it with the same attitude she brought to everything, which was to assess what was needed, prepare as well as you could, and then simply get through the hard parts and not make too much of them. It was harder than the first winter in one specific way, which was that Abel was sometimes gone for 4 and 5 days at a time, when weather conditions required the whole crew to stay out with the herd, working the winter range in conditions that Kate understood intellectually, but that still produced in her, in the very early morning hours when the wind was at its worst, a particular tight anxiety that she managed by getting up and making something useful happen with her hands. She improved the schoolhouse in the gaps between hard weather. She organized the books, repaired 2 desk legs that had been wobbly since September, created a new reading program for the youngest students that she had been designing in her head since early autumn. She wrote long letters to Abel's brother Thomas, who had gone back to Nebraska but written asking if there might be land worth settling near Harlan Creek, and she gave him an honest and detailed picture of the valley, its challenges and its qualities both, because she was not a woman who sold things short or oversold them. Louis Reyes had been joined that year by his sister Rosa, who was 6 and had apparently decided within the first week of school that she and Kate were specifically in alliance with each other, a decision Kate accepted with the same seriousness with which it was offered. Rosa's favorite subject was everything, which Kate found deeply encouraging, and she was already reading above her level by November. Abel came home from a 5-day stint on the winter range in January with cold in his bones and something close to exhausted, and Kate met him at the door with the fire going and supper ready, and the kind of clear-eyed practical warmth that was better than any fuss, because it was exactly what a tired, cold man needed. And he sat down at the table and ate and then sat by the fire, and she sat with him, and they talked quietly about the week until he fell asleep in the chair. And she got a blanket and covered him and sat a while longer, watching him sleep, and felt the great, quiet weight of loving someone in a way that includes the ordinary. Spring of 1880 came with the welcome certainty of things that have survived winter. The valley greened. The creek ran high and then settled. The ranch moved into the busy rhythms of calving season, which took Abel away for long days, and Kate finished her second school year in Harlan Creek with 11 students, 3 more than she had started with the previous October, and submitted her supply requests for the 3rd year with the confidence of someone who fully intended to be there for it. She was expecting their first child, which she had told Abel in February with a calm directness that matched his own, sitting across the kitchen table from him with her hands flat on the surface. And he had looked at her for one long, still moment, and then crossed around the table to her, and held her with a careful, enormous tenderness that undid her slightly, which she was willing to accept as a reasonable response. The pregnancy was unremarkable, which was what she hoped for, and she taught school until the middle of September, when the baby was due in late October, and the physical reality of late pregnancy made the walk to the schoolhouse in the first deep autumn cold more effort than it needed to be. She arranged for James Whitfield, who was 17 now and entirely competent, to manage the school for the week she was away, with specific instructions and lesson plans that were detailed enough that she was confident the children would not fall behind. Their son was born on the 22nd of October, 1880, in the bedroom of the house on the east side of the Dent property, with Maria Reyes in attendance as the most experienced mother in their immediate circle and the town's doctor, a patient, bearded man named Dr. Harker, who was also present and who told Kate afterward that she had done extremely well, to which she said she had not had a great deal of choice in the matter, which made him laugh. Abel held his son for the first time with the particular awe of a man who is not easily undone and who is, at that moment, absolutely undone. He sat in the chair beside the bed with this small, definite person in his arms, and Kate watched his face and thought she had never seen him look quite like that, stripped of everything except what he actually was, which was a man of extraordinary depth who loved the things he loved with a completeness that was not often visible on the surface. "He looks like a person who has decided something," she said. "What has he decided? I don't know yet, but he looks very decided about it." They named him William Thomas Barlow. William for no particular reason except that it was a good solid name that sat well, and Thomas for Abel's brother, which produced in Thomas, when he received the letter, a response that was 3 times longer than any previous letter he had sent and considerably more emotional. Kate was back in the schoolroom by January, which was later than she would have chosen purely logistically, but which Dr. Harker had recommended, and Abel had supported with a very specific and calm look that told her he agreed with the doctor on this one, and was prepared to say so if needed. She brought William to school twice a week, which the children thought was the finest thing that had happened in the schoolroom since Rosa Reyes had brought her mother's tamales to share at the winter social. The children took turns holding him with a seriousness that was simultaneously hilarious and moving, and Louis Reyes, now 10, delivered a small formal speech about the responsibilities of being held by babies that made Kate turn toward the window to compose herself. The years of the early 1880s settled into the particular richness of a life that is hard and full and genuinely good. The winter of 1881 was brutal even by Harlan Creek standards, and Kate and Abel navigated it with the accumulated practice of people who know what they are doing and trust each other absolutely to do their share. Abel's brother Thomas did in fact come to Wyoming in the spring of 1881 and settled a claim on the northern end of the valley, which brought Thomas within 12 miles, and Abel and Thomas repaired something between them that had been held together at long distance for years, and Kate watched that repair happen with a great deal of quiet satisfaction. The school grew. By the school year of 1882, Kate had 16 students and had submitted a proposal to the Territorial Board of Education for an expansion of the schoolroom and a small library collection, citing enrollment numbers and community support that included signatures from every family with children in the school and several without. The proposal was approved in the spring, and the expansion was built over the summer, and the small library was stocked partly with donated books from families across the valley, and partly with a collection Kate had ordered from a publisher in Chicago, using funds she had saved from her salary, and that Abel had contributed to without making it into anything except what it was, which was an investment in something she had built and that mattered. Esteban Reyes had become, by 1882, a man who was established and known in Harlan Creek in the way that hard work and good character and time will eventually establish a man, even in a territory where those qualities were not always sufficient against other forces. He had taken on some leadership in the small community of Spanish-speaking settlers in the valley, of which there were now 4 families, and he came to Kate sometimes with concerns about their children's experience in school, not with complaints, but with the particular careful honesty of someone who trusts you enough to tell you the real thing. She listened and she acted, and when there were problems in the schoolroom with how students treated each other, she addressed them directly and without pretending they were something smaller than they were, because the injustice of a child feeling unwelcome in a place of learning was not something she was willing to tiptoe around. There were 2 incidents over those years where she had to speak with parents directly about their children's behavior toward the Reyes children and toward a half-Cherokee girl named Nora who joined the school in 1882. And both conversations were difficult in the way that any honest conversation about prejudice is difficult, and she had them anyway, and she did not stop teaching those children because their parents held ignorant views. Because the best argument against ignorance is education, and she was a person who believed in arguments that work. Abel and Kate's second child was born in the spring of 1883, a girl they named Margaret after Abel's mother, who had carried the compass and read everything she could find and taught her children in the evenings. Margaret Barlow arrived with the quality that sometimes skips a generation and lands complete, which was an absolute certainty about her own preferences, opinions, and schedule, and she exercised all 3 with great conviction from approximately the first hour. William, who was 2.5 when Margaret arrived, received her with a solemn inspection, and then apparently decided she was acceptable because he brought her a piece of string, which was his most valued current possession, and placed it near her blanket, and said something in the particular language of toddlers that his parents could not fully translate, but which had the tone of a welcoming speech. Abel held Margaret the way he had held William, with that same complete, uncomplicated love that lived very quietly inside him most of the time, and came to the surface only at moments that earned it. And Kate watched him and felt the thing that she had felt standing on the ridge in May of 1879, which was the certain knowledge of being exactly where she was supposed to be, and it was not smaller for being familiar. It was, if anything, larger, because now it had years of living in it. The summer of 1883 was a good one by Wyoming standards. The grass was strong and the herd was healthy, and the creek ran well into August, which was not always the case. James Whitfield, now 20, had gone to study in Cheyenne at the Territorial College that had opened there, carrying with him a specific and applied love of mathematics and natural science that Kate had spent 3 years carefully cultivating. And he wrote her a letter in June to tell her that his first professor had told him he was better prepared than most of his classmates, and that he wanted her to know that. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and Abel watched her read it, and when she folded it up she looked at him and said, "That is what it is all about," and he said, "I know," and that was enough. Louis Reyes turned 13 that summer, and was already the best reader in whatever room he was in. Kate was working with Esteban and Maria about the possibility of Louis going to school in Cheyenne in a few years, which would require money and planning, and the particular courage of a family sending their child into a world that was not always glad to have him. And they discussed it as families do, with great love and great practicality, and the willingness to do hard things for the sake of something worth doing. The Red Clay Saloon, which had existed since before Kate arrived in Harlan Creek, and which had always been a place where the ordinary commerce of men's lives in frontier towns happened, had a new owner in the summer of 1883, a man named Grant who was more interested in the gambling side of the business than the previous owner had been. And there were 3 incidents of loud disturbances on the main street that year that required Sheriff Tate to involve himself. And on one occasion, a window in a building 2 doors down was broken by something that came out of the saloon at speed. Kate found all of this tiresome, and said so at the next community meeting, along with several other people, and there was a conversation between Sheriff Tate and the new owner Grant that appeared to result in some improvement. Abel had his own encounter with Grant in September, when Grant made some comments at the general store about the Reyes family that were of the kind that Abel had no patience for under any circumstances, and less patience for when they were said in front of Esteban Reyes's 8-year-old son, who was there picking up supplies. Abel's response was quiet and direct, and Grant apparently found it persuasive, because he did not make those comments publicly again in Abel's hearing, and the particular reputation for quiet persuasion that Abel had built over his years in the valley was, Kate thought, one of the most useful things about him. She told him this later, and he raised an eyebrow at her. "You are not supposed to be persuasive by reputation," he said. "You are supposed to be persuasive by being right." "Both help," she said. "You have an extremely practical mind." "Thank you," she said, and meant it. In the autumn of 1884, Kate stood in her expanded schoolroom on the first day of the school year and counted 21 students, the most the school had ever had, ranging from Rosa Reyes, who was 9 and sitting in the front with the expression of someone who has already decided they are going to participate in everything, to Nora, who was 13 and had blossomed over 2 years into a student of remarkable quiet intelligence, to 3 new children from a Scandinavian-speaking family who had settled the northwest quarter of the valley over the summer and who arrived nervous and stayed curious, which was the best she could have hoped for. She was 30 years old. She had been in Harlan Creek for 6 years. She knew the names of every family in the valley and the condition of their circumstances and the aspirations of their children. She knew the names of the ridgelines and the patterns of the weather, and which way the wind shifted when a storm was coming from the north. She knew her husband in the way that years of real living together produces, which is not without difficulty or friction but is so much richer for containing both, because you cannot actually know someone without seeing them under pressure, and she had seen Abel under pressure and he had seen her, and what they had found was that they were both, fundamentally, who they had said they were. The winter of 1884 into 1885 brought the conversation about the future to something more concrete, as futures tend to do when there are 2 children and a school and a ranch and 6 years of built life holding still for a moment and asking, what next? Abel had been speaking with Dent about the land purchase rights that were part of his arrangement with the ranch, and Dent, who was nearly 60 and thinking about the disposition of his holdings, had made Abel an offer on a specific 160-acre parcel adjacent to where their house stood, a piece of land with good water access and strong grass, and enough shelter from the ridgeline to make it manageable as a small, independent cattle operation. It was not a large operation. It would not be a wealthy one, at least not at first, but it would be theirs, and Abel had worked the valley long enough to know what to do with 160 acres of good Wyoming land. He brought it to Kate with the numbers laid out the way he brought everything important, with full information and genuine openness about the risk and the potential. She listened and asked questions, the specific and practical kind that he had come to rely on, because she had no interest in false reassurance and an excellent eye for what he might have failed to adequately consider. "What is the water situation in a dry year?" she asked. He explained the creek access and the secondary spring on the northeast corner. "What is your timeline for the first viable revenue generation?" 2 years for the first proper calf crop from a small seed herd, he said. "I can continue foreman work for Dent through that period, and the purchase price against our current savings." He showed her the figures. She looked at them for a while. "We would need to be careful with the household money for the first 2 years, she said. "Yes. My salary covers our regular expenses with some to spare," she said. "We can manage it." She looked up at him. "Yes, let us do this." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she loved, the one that lived between gratitude and something deeper than gratitude. "You are certain?" "I am always certain when I have thought something through properly," she said. "Are you?" "I have wanted this since I first rode over that parcel," he said. "I have just been waiting to be able to make it real." "Well," she said, "now you can." They finalized the purchase with Dent in the spring of 1885, and the Barlow Ranch, which they did not name formally for another year, but which they thought of privately as theirs from the moment the papers were signed, began. Abel built a small fence line that first spring with Thomas's help and 3 hands from the original Dent crew who had given good years alongside him. And Kate walked the perimeter of their 160 acres on a May afternoon with William, who was 4, running ahead on the path, and Margaret, nearly 2, balanced on her hip, and looked out over the grass and the mountains and the late afternoon sky, and felt the enormous, clear-lit fact of it. She thought about her father's quarter section in Minnesota, the frozen land he had left her, that she had sold before coming west. She thought about those winter mornings with the rope strung between the house and the barn, because the visibility was too poor to navigate otherwise. She thought about the woman she had been when she stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek in the autumn of 1878, holding her own trunk and looking at the wind with the settled certainty that she was not going to be defeated by a climate. She thought about the compass in the pocket of her work apron, which she carried every day, which still pointed true. She looked down at William, who had found something interesting near the fence post and was examining it with the full commitment of a 4-year-old, and at Margaret on her hip, who was looking at the mountains with a very serious expression. And she thought about Abel, who would come home this evening from the western field where he was working the early fence line, and sit down at the table with the same hunger and tiredness and quiet pleasure in being home that he had always had, which never became ordinary in the way that things you do not intend to become ordinary. The summer of 1885 was a working summer, as all their summers were, and it was good. The small seed herd Abel had purchased in the spring was doing well on the summer grass. The school was in excellent shape heading into the fall term. William had discovered that he had a strong interest in animals, which surprised no one who had watched him at the schoolroom on the days Kate brought the children, and he followed Abel around the property with a devotion that Abel accepted with a seriousness that William clearly found appropriate and satisfying. Margaret had decided by age 2 that she liked books. This was possibly the least surprising thing that had ever happened in the Barlow house, but the specific quality of Margaret's relationship with books, which was both passionate and proprietary, suggested to Kate that her daughter might one day be running something educational and not apologizing about it. Thomas Barlow had married in 1884, a woman named Clara who was steady and capable and who Kate had liked immediately, and they had settled into their claim on the north of the valley with a good harvest and a child due in the winter of 1885, and the two families visited each other on Sundays when the work allowed. Those Sunday afternoons, sitting on one or the other's porch with the children moving around them and the mountains in the distance and the coffee on and the conversation going wherever it wanted to go, were some of the best hours of Kate's life, and she knew it while they were happening, which is the rarest and most valuable kind of knowing. By the fall of 1885, Kate had been teaching in Harlan Creek for 7 years. She was organizing the school year with a confidence and familiarity that still did not diminish her excitement about it, because the children were new every year, and the work of connecting them to learning was new every year, and she had not yet found a student she could not find a way into. Louis Reyes was 15 and had been having conversations with his father about Cheyenne for 2 years. In October of 1885, Esteban came to Kate with a specific plan. A family in Cheyenne, connected to the Reyes family through a distant relation, was willing to host Louis while he attended school there, and the territorial school in Cheyenne had accepted him based on a letter of recommendation that Kate had written with considerable care and considerable specific evidence of exactly what Louis Reyes was capable of. Esteban brought her the acceptance letter and they sat at her kitchen table and she read it and looked up at him, and he looked at her with everything he was feeling showing completely on his face, which was something Esteban rarely allowed, and she reached across the table and shook his hand and said, "He is going to be extraordinary," and Esteban said, quietly and with great precision, "Because of you," and she said, "Because of himself and you and Maria," and he said, "Also because of you," and she let that stand. Louis left for Cheyenne in January of 1886, accompanied by his father for the first leg of the journey, and Rosa cried at school the day after he left, and Kate let her and sat with her and told her the true thing, that her brother was going to do something great, and that she might too, and that the school was not going to stop asking the most of her just because Louis had gone. The winter of 1885 to 1886 was the hardest winter Kate and Abel had yet faced on their own land. The cold that year was the kind that the old-timers in Harlan Creek spoke of in the way people speak of things that test whether they are as strong as they think they are. Abel lost 7 head of cattle to a 2-day ice storm in February that came on too fast to get all the herd into shelter, and he came home those nights with the particular hard-set silence of a man carrying a loss that is financial, but also something beyond financial, the weight of having worked at something and been unable to protect it completely. Kate did not try to make it smaller than it was. She sat with him in the silence, and she made sure the fire was good and the food was hot, and that when he was ready to talk, she was there to listen, and when he was not ready to talk, she was there anyway. On the 3rd night after the storm he talked and she listened, and eventually he said, "We will recover from this," and she said, "Of course we will," not because she was brushing past it, but because she was absolutely certain it was true and she needed him to hear her certainty, which had always been one of the most useful things she had. They did recover. The spring calf crop in 1886 was strong, and Abel renegotiated his foreman contract with Dent to a part-time consulting basis that gave him more time for their own operation while still honoring the relationship he had with the older man, who was slowing down now and thinking seriously about how the larger ranch would be managed in the coming years. In September of 1886, Kate and Abel had a conversation about the school that had been coming for some time. The Territorial Board of Education had written to propose that the Harlan Creek School be formally upgraded to a two-room schoolhouse with 2 teachers, given the enrollment growth, and had asked if Kate would be willing to serve as the head teacher and help select and supervise a second teacher to manage the younger grades. She came home from her meeting with Mayor Elwood about the proposal and sat down across from Abel at the table and told him, and he listened, and when she was done he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to do it," she said. "I want to build something here that lasts past me." "Then do it," he said without hesitation. "It will take more of my time. At least in the first year." "We will manage," he said. "Thomas and Clara are close. The children are old enough to help with small things, and I am not a man who cannot cook his own supper." "You cannot cook your own supper," she said. "I am a man who can learn to cook his own supper," he corrected, with that slight curve of his mouth that she loved. She laughed and accepted the proposal. The two-room schoolhouse opened in the spring of 1887, with a second teacher named Miss Alvarez, who was from Santa Fe and was young and competent and slightly overwhelmed by Wyoming in March, a feeling Kate recognized and addressed with the practical warmth that she had always found more useful than sympathy alone. Miss Alvarez became, over the course of that first year, someone Kate respected deeply, and she stayed in Harlan Creek for the following 5 years and eventually married the doctor who replaced Dr. Harker in 1889, which Kate found extremely satisfying. Abel and Kate's third child was born in the summer of 1887, a boy they named Esteban Joseph Barlow, the first name chosen specifically and in full knowledge of who it honored. And when Kate sent a note to Esteban Reyes to tell him, the response that came back was brief and exactly right. A single line of thanks that contained more real feeling than a page would have. Joseph, as they called him to distinguish from his namesake, was from the beginning a different kind of child than his siblings, easier in some ways and more complicated in others. A child who felt everything very close to the surface, and who cried easily and laughed easily, and who loved with an intensity that sometimes seemed almost too large for his small frame. Kate held him and thought that this one would need careful handling, not because he was fragile but because he was so very open, and she intended to be there for every bit of it. By 1888, the Barlow Ranch was profitable. Not largely, not extravagantly, but solidly and honestly, with a herd that had grown from the small spring seed to something real, and a winter loss rate that was down to a level that Abel had worked hard to achieve through better shelter construction and smarter winter range management. He was known in the valley now not just as the former Dent foreman, but as a man who ran his own operation well and who was consulted by the smaller homesteaders about range practices and water rights, both of which had been contentious issues in the territory throughout the decade. He had given his time to those conversations with the same steady consistency that he brought to everything, because he remembered what it was to be a young man in a new place, trying to make something work without the resources that made things easier, and because Kate had reinforced in him something he had already believed, which was that a community is only as functional as the equity within it. Rosa Reyes, who was now 13, was the kind of student who made a teacher want to be better at their job, which Kate took as the highest possible compliment. She had her brother's mathematical mind and something additional of her own, a writer's eye for the particular detail, the specific image, the precise word. Kate had started giving her additional reading assignments in literature that were well above her year level, and Rosa received them the way a person receives something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was gentler than the previous 3 had been, which felt like a gift, and Kate accepted it as one. She was 34 now, and she was in the fullness of a life that was not easy but that was enormously, specifically good. She walked to school in the mornings and came home in the late afternoons, and sat with her children through the evenings and lay beside her husband in the dark, and listened to the wind off the ridgeline and the sound of the house, and felt the weight of things that have been built in that stand. Abel, at 38, was a man who had come into himself completely. The years of working his own land had given him a settled authority that was different from the authority of competence he had always had. It was the authority of someone who has made commitments and kept them through the hard times, and does not need to announce this because it is simply visible. His hair was threaded with some silver now at the temples, which Kate told him looked distinguished, and which he told her was simply old, and she told him it was absolutely both. Thomas and Clara Barlow had 3 children by 1889, and the two families met for Sunday afternoons when possible, and for the major community gatherings that Harlan Creek maintained throughout the year. And Thomas's oldest boy, a 6-year-old named Daniel, had developed an attachment to William Barlow that was the absolute bond of small boys who have decided on each other, which Kate found deeply charming. In the spring of 1889, news came through that Wyoming was moving toward statehood, which finally arrived in July of 1890. Harlan Creek celebrated in the manner of a town that had existed through the territorial years and knew the difference, and Kate stood on the main street in the July heat and listened to Mayor Elwood give a speech that was, this time, appropriate in length, and felt the particular satisfaction of being present for something historical. The school had 31 students by 1890 and 2 full rooms and a 3rd teacher, a young man named Calloway who taught the upper grades alongside Kate, and who was good with the older boys in the way that some male teachers are, not because he was easier on them, but because certain 14-year-old boys respond to a male authority with less resistance, which Kate acknowledged pragmatically, because the outcome for the students was what mattered. Louis Reyes came back to visit in the summer of 1890, which was the summer after he had completed his studies in Cheyenne. He was 20 now, tall and self-possessed, and carrying a quality that Kate had always known was in him, which was a specific kind of certainty that comes from being educated and knowing you are. He sat in her kitchen and drank coffee and told her his plans, which were to return to the valley and work with his family's land, but also to pursue a position as an interpreter and legal advocate for the Spanish-speaking families in the territory, several of whom had ongoing land disputes that required someone who understood both the legal documents and the community's actual situation. She listened to all of it, and when he finished she said, "That is exactly right. That is exactly what you should do," he said. "I would not have known this was possible without you," she said. "You showed me what was possible. I just held the door open." He looked at her and said, with the directness of someone who has learned to speak honestly from people who modeled it, "You held it open when you did not have to. That is the part that mattered." She held that close for a long time. The years of the early 1890s moved with the particular quality of years that are full and fast, and that even while they are happening, are among the best of your life. William, in 1892, was 12 and already spending his after-school hours working alongside Abel on the ranch, with a focus and capability that Abel spoke of, with a careful pride that Kate found lovely. Margaret, at 9, had read everything in the school's small library, and had started writing stories that she presented to Kate with the slightly aggressive confidence of a person who knows they are good at something and wants it acknowledged. Kate acknowledged it honestly and specifically, because her daughter deserved honest acknowledgement. Joseph, at 5, was in Rosa Reyes's class at school, which Rosa had begun teaching in 1891, having returned from a year at the normal school in Cheyenne with a certification of her own. Kate thought about the 10-year-old boy with enormous eyes who had come to school nervous and the woman she had become, and she thought, this is how it works. This is how the world gets incrementally better, one room at a time, one child at a time, one person who decides to hold the door open. Abel's 50th birthday was in the summer of 1900, which was a Thursday, and Kate organized a gathering at the house with Thomas and Clara and their family, and the Ray's family and several of the neighbors and ranch hands who had been part of their lives over the years. It was a warm summer evening, and they sat on the wide porch and in the yard, and the mountains were lit gold and purple in the late evening light, and there was enough food and enough conversation, and enough laughter that the evening stretched well past sundown. Abel sat on the porch steps for a while later when the guests had mostly gone and the children were inside and the yard was quieting, and Kate sat beside him, and the sky above the valley was enormous with stars, the same stars that had been there when they stood on this porch in their first winter, and she had said, "Here is where I want to be." "Happy birthday," she said. "I don't feel any different," he said. "You look exactly the same," she said. "You are lying," he said, "but I appreciate it." "I am not lying," she said, and took his hand. "You look like yourself. That is not the same as looking exactly the same, but it is considerably better." He looked at her, this man, this particular man who had come around the corner of the general store with his coat on and his rope over his shoulder, and looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said she should know the winters were brutal, and she had told him she was not raised to fear the cold, and she had meant it, and everything that had come after had been the proof. "I have been thinking," he said, about the fact that I have had everything I wanted," he said, simply and completely. "I wanted this valley and this land and this work, and I wanted you, and I have had all of it. I have had 21 years of it. I do not take that lightly." Kate looked at the stars above the valley, then at her husband beside her, then at the house behind them where their children were, and all the years of their life together were stored in the walls and the floors and the worn smooth places and the particular light. "No," she said. "Neither do I." She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they sat there on the porch steps in the Wyoming night, in the valley between the ridgelines, on the land that was theirs and that they had made something from, and the wind came down off the high ground, cold and clean, and neither of them moved away from it. Their life continued past that evening and past that year, as lives do when they have been built well. William took over increasing management of the ranch as the new century turned, with Abel's guidance, and then with Abel's partnership, and then, gradually, with his own authority, which was of a different quality than his father's but no less genuine for that. Margaret went east to study at the age of 18, to a normal school in Ohio that accepted women, and came back at 22 with a teaching certificate and a fierce, articulate ambition that she applied to the expansion of educational opportunity for women in the new state of Wyoming, which was, Kate observed with a profound personal satisfaction, entirely appropriate. Joseph became, as Kate had somehow always known he would, an artist, a painter of the Western landscape, and his paintings had a quality of light and particularity about them that told anyone looking that here was someone who had grown up watching something carefully and had learned to see it. Abel lived to be 72, which was a good and full age, and he died on his land in the winter of 1922, quietly and without drama, in the way he had always done things. Kate was 67 and she was present, and she held his hand and she said everything that needed to be said, and he said what he wanted to say, and the house was warm and the valley was white outside the window, and she did not look away. She mourned him the way you mourn someone who has been so much of your life that their absence is like a change in the quality of the air, present in every breath. She mourned him honestly and completely, and she did not try to make it smaller than it was. She sat with her children and her grandchildren and Thomas and Clara, who were both still living on their land to the north, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. And then, in the manner of women who have never been afraid of hard things and who have always known that the work of living does not stop when living becomes painful, she continued. She continued to teach. She was still the head teacher at the Harlan Creek School at 67. Though she had taken a less intensive role in the daily classroom management in recent years. focusing more on the oversight of the program and the mentorship of the younger teachers, of which there were now 4 in a school that had 3 rooms and 62 students. She went in on Monday and Wednesday mornings, and she sat with the newer teachers, and she told them things about teaching that could only be known from 30-plus years of doing it, and they listened because it was worth listening to. Louis Reyes had become, by the 1920s, a well-known figure in the territory and then the state, a legal advocate whose work on behalf of Spanish-speaking and indigenous communities had made him someone whose name was spoken with respect by people in positions of power who did not always want to hear what he was saying, but who had found over the years that he was usually right. He came back to Harlan Creek when he could, and he always came to see Kate, and they sat at the kitchen table where they had sat when he was 15, and she was telling him he was going to be extraordinary, and now she just looked at him and saw that he was. Rosa Reyes taught at the Harlan Creek School until she was 45, and then she moved to Cheyenne and became the director of a school for girls from families that had historically been excluded from formal education, which was the kind of work that requires both great patience and great stubbornness, both of which Rosa had in considerable supply. On a morning in October of 1923, Kate Garner Barlow walked to the school in Harlan Creek, which she had walked to for 45 years, in the early autumn cold that came down from the ridgeline in the way she had long since ceased to think about because it was simply the air she breathed. She was 68 years old, and she was wearing her good coat and her wool scarf and her boots, and she carried, in the pocket of her coat, the brass compass that had been Abel's mother's, and then Abel's gift to her and then hers, for 45 years, still pointing true. She went in and looked at the schoolroom, which was larger and better appointed than the one she had first stepped into in October of 1878, and she thought about all the children who had sat in it and all the things they had learned there, and all the things she had learned from them, which was at least as much. She thought about Pearl, who was now 39 and had 3 children of her own and lived in Casper. She thought about James Whitfield, who was a professor of natural science in Denver and still wrote to her twice a year. She thought about Nora, who had gone back to her mother's people after leaving school, and who had sent Kate a letter 10 years ago with a photograph of her own children and a message that Kate had kept in the drawer of her desk. She pulled the compass from her pocket and held it in her hand, and the needle swung and settled, and it pointed north the way it always had, steady and certain and unchanged. She thought about a man coming around the corner of the general store with a coiled rope over his shoulder and eyes like deep creek water. She thought about a church hall and a bad fiddle and a cold street at Christmas. She thought about a ridge above a valley in May and a simple gold ring, and yes, that is the direction I want to go. She thought about 21 years of ordinary mornings and difficult winters and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of being known by someone who chose you again every day. She thought about what she had told him on that October afternoon in 1878 when he had said the winters were brutal, and she had said, "Good. I was not raised to fear the cold." She had not been. She was not now. The cold was simply the condition of being here, of being alive in this place and in this life, and she had always known that the cold was worth it for what came with it, the beauty and the clarity and the particular intensity of warmth that only means something in contrast with the cold that surrounds it. She put the compass back in her pocket and went to her desk and sat down, and when the door opened at 8 o'clock and the children began to come in out of the morning cold, trailing scarves and red-cheeked and loud with the news of their mornings, she looked up at them and felt what she always felt. Ready, still ready, always ready. The school bell rang over Harlan Creek, clear and cold in the October morning, the same bell that had been ringing since 1878, and Kate Garner Barlow sat at her desk in the schoolroom she had built and tended for 45 years, in the valley she had chosen and that had chosen her, with the compass in her pocket pointing true, and she began.